The desert stretched endlessly, a vast canvas of sand and stone that shimmered under the unforgiving Arizona sun. Heat waves danced across the horizon like illusions, blurring the edges of mountains that looked closer than they were. The air was heavy, the kind that scorched throats and baked skin in minutes. Yet Captain Rachel Porter barely noticed. Lying prone in the dust, rifle cradled against her shoulder, she felt more alive than she ever did anywhere else. Her cheek pressed against the stock of the rifle. She adjusted the scope with deliberate care. Every turn of the dial was measured, purposeful. She didn't think about the heat or the sweat trickling down her back. Her entire focus rested on the target 2,000 yards away, just a practice silhouette, a steel plate painted white, but in her mind it was alive. To her, every target was alive, because one day the difference between cardboard and flesh could mean lives saved or lost. Rachel had been here before, countless times. Years of training had molded her into one of the finest marksmen the military had produced, but respect was never handed to her. She had clawed for every ounce of it. When she first joined the sniper program, whispers followed her like shadows. Too small, too light, not built for the demands of long-range shooting. Men who thought endurance was only measured by muscle doubted her ability to hold steady under weight, to crawl through mud with gear that seemed heavier than she was. But Rachel understood something they didn't. Sniping wasn't about size or strength. It was about patience, discipline, and a willingness to endure solitude. It was about trusting numbers when nerves screamed otherwise. She had mastered the mathematics of ballistics wind velocity, barometric pressure, altitude, and even the Earth's subtle rotation. To Rachel, each factor wasn't an obstacle, but part of a formula waiting to be solved. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. Breath steady. One heartbeat, then another. On the third exhale, she squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a muted crack echoing across the desert. A moment later, the steel target rang with the sweet metallic ping of a perfect hit. Another shot, another confirmation of why she belonged here. Rachel lifted her head from the scope and scanned the barren field. Training ranges were lonely places, but loneliness never bothered her. It sharpened her focus. She was used to silence, used to relying on nothing but her own calculations. Out here, there was no competition, no doubters, just her rifle, and the truth of a shot. It wasn't always this way. Growing up in Colorado, Rachel had been the quiet kid who loved puzzles. While others played sports, she was in her backyard, balancing bottles on fences and testing how far she could throw rocks with consistent accuracy. Her father, a retired hunter, gave her a small .22 rifle when she was barely 12. She remembered the first time she aimed at a soda can 50 yards away. Her father expected her to miss. She didn't. She hit the can dead center, not once, but 5 times in a row. "That's not luck," he had muttered, shaking his head with surprise. "That's instinct." Those early lessons never left her. She devoured books on physics, learning how objects move through space. In high school, while others chased popularity, Rachel chased precision. College felt suffocating, so she enlisted, determined to channel her obsession into service. The Army tested her, broke her down, then built her back up. Every obstacle was another chance to prove she belonged. Now, years later, she was captain. Porter, known in whispers among her peers as the one who doesn't miss. Yet Rachel never embraced the title. She knew better than anyone that perfection didn't exist in her line of work. A shot could drift inches off course because of something invisible, something as small as a gust of wind a mile away. What mattered wasn't arrogance, but preparation. As she cleaned her rifle on the range, an officer approached, boots crunching. "Over gravel." "Captain Porter," he said, voice clipped. "Command wants you in briefing." Rachel looked up, curious. Briefings happened daily, but this tone wasn't routine. She packed her gear with practiced speed and followed him across the compound, dust swirling around their steps. Inside the briefing room, the air was cooler, humming with tension. A map was pinned to the wall, red circles marking territories. Across hostile terrain overseas. Around the table sat high-ranking officers, their faces grim. Rachel's gaze fell on one man, Sergeant Michael Hawley. Broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, he was another sniper with years of experience. The commander cleared his throat. "We've identified a high-value insurgent leader operating here," he said, pointing to one of the red circles. "This individual has orchestrated multiple attacks against our forces. Eliminating him could dismantle an entire network." Rachel's jaw tightened. Missions like this were rare and dangerous, the kind that left no room for error. The commander continued. "Sergeant Hawley attempted the shot last week. It was a near miss." A ripple moved across the room. Hawley remained stone-faced, though Rachel noticed the tightness in his hands. Missing wasn't shameful, it happened to everyone, but missing a target this important carried consequences. The insurgent had been alerted. Security was tighter. Another attempt would be far riskier. Command laid out the problem. Conventional strikes were off the table. Too much collateral damage. The only option was another long-range attempt. But this time, the distance would be even greater. Nearly 2 miles farther back, beyond what most considered possible. The room was heavy with silence. Then Rachel spoke. "I'll take the shot." All eyes turned to her. Some skeptical, some surprised. She didn't flinch. "You realize the difficulty," one officer said. "Yes, sir," Rachel replied. Her voice didn't waver. "I also realize it's not impossible." Hawley studied her, then gave the smallest nod of respect. He understood the weight of what she volunteered for. When the meeting adjourned, Rachel walked out into the blinding sun, heart steady. Others might see this mission as reckless, maybe even suicidal. But she saw it as another puzzle, the most complex one she had ever faced. And puzzles, no matter how difficult, always had solutions. She returned to the range, laid her rifle down, and began running the numbers in her mind. Wind speed at dawn, humidity levels, elevation drop across the ridge, all of it raced through. Her brain like equations on a chalkboard. To most, the factors looked overwhelming. To Rachel, they were simply variables waiting for alignment. That night, under the stars, she stared at the sky and felt the gravity of what lay ahead. Failure meant strengthening the enemy. Success meant altering the course of a conflict. Alone in the silence, she whispered to herself, steady and sure, "I'll make the shot." And deep inside, she believed it. Sergeant Michael Hawley hadn't spoken much since his attempt. The mist lingered in the air like an unwelcome shadow, one that followed him through every corridor of the base. Hawley was no rookie. He had years of experience, countless confirmed. Hits and a reputation for keeping cool under pressure. But reputation didn't erase the fact that his bullet, traveling across hostile skies at near supersonic speed, had curved just inches off its mark. Inches that changed everything. The insurgent leader had survived. Not only survived, but vanished into a network of caves and compounds, guarded now by layers of fighters. Rachel heard whispers around camp. Some soldiers spoke with sympathy, others with criticism. A few dismissed Hale's miss as a fluke, while others treated it like proof the mission was doomed. She noticed how Hawley carried himself shoulders square, jaw tight, but eyes distant. He hadn't forgiven himself. For Rachel, Hale's failure wasn't a mark of incompetence. It was a reminder of reality. Long-range shooting was as much science as it was art, and sometimes the smallest unseen factor could turn perfection into disaster. Wind gusts miles away, the angle of light refracting through heat waves, or even the Earth's subtle spin could nudge a bullet astray. Missing didn't make Hale any less skilled. It made the task more daunting for whoever came next. The briefing replayed in Rachel's mind like a scene carved in stone. The commander's voice had been sharp, almost accusatory. Sergeant Hale fired from 1.5 miles out. Close, but not close enough. The target was warmed. Security doubled. If we attempt again, the shot must be taken from a greater distance, beyond the insurgents' perimeter. Sir, one officer had objected, 2 miles farther is beyond. Standard operational range. That's pushing into the realm of theoretical. Rachel had watched the hesitation spread across the table like smoke. Nobody wanted to be the one to volunteer. Nobody wanted to own the risk of another failure. The stakes were higher now. The insurgent knew he was being hunted. Another miss wouldn't just alert him. It would embolden him. It was then that Rachel spoke, her voice steady, cutting through the tension. "I'll take it." The words had silenced the room. Officers turned toward her, eyes filled with doubt. Some saw arrogance, others desperation. To Rachel, it was neither. It was duty. The commander narrowed his gaze. "Captain Porter, you understand the difficulty?" "Yes, sir," she replied, without hesitation. "You'd be attempting a shot from a distance few in history have ever succeeded at." Rachel held his stare. "Then I'll study harder than anyone who has tried." The conversation ended with no fanfare, just the weight of her commitment hanging in the air. As the room cleared, Hale remained seated. He finally looked at her, a long, measured glance. There was no resentment in his eyes, only something that surprised her, respect. Later, as the sun set, Rachel found herself walking alone along the perimeter fence. She replayed every detail of the mission plan in her head. She imagined the terrain, the likely positions, the obstacles. For most soldiers, this would be overwhelming. For her, it was exhilarating. The greater the challenge, the sharper her focus became. But beneath her calm, there was gravity. She wasn't just stepping into another mission. She was stepping into the space left behind by Hale's miss. She knew the unspoken truth. If she failed, there might not be another chance. That night, Hale found her at the training range. He carried no rifle, just his weary presence. "You really think you can do it?" he asked, voice low. Rachel didn't look up from cleaning her weapon. "I wouldn't have volunteered if I didn't." He studied her for a moment. "Don't make the mistake of thinking I miscalculated. My math was solid. Conditions shifted, barely detectable. Just a gust no one could have predicted." "I know," Rachel said, meeting his gaze. "I don't think you failed. I think the conditions changed." Something softened in Hale's expression. "Then you know how thin the margin is." "Yes," she said, "and I'll narrow it." For the first time since the miss, Hale allowed himself a faint smile. "If anyone can, it's you." The next days were a blur of preparation. Command authorized additional intelligence sweeps of the terrain where the shot would take place. Drones mapped elevations, ridges, and valleys. Weather teams provided atmospheric data. Analysts built models predicting how wind currents shifted across the region at different times of day. Every scrap of information fed into Rachel's growing equation. She spent hours poring over the maps, tracing with her finger where she believed the insurgent would move. She studied the angles of ridges, looking for cover, searching for the one vantage point that would give her both distance and clarity. Sleep came rarely. When it did, her dreams were filled with numbers and trajectories, equations spinning like constellations across the night sky. She dreamed of bullets bending with the Earth's curve, of winds whispering secrets only she could. Here, every morning, she woke with new calculations to test. On the range, she fired relentlessly, adjusting, refining. punishing herself for shots that strayed even a fraction of an inch. Other soldiers began watching her in silence. They had doubted before, but now they saw something different. Determination that bordered on obsession. Precision that demanded respect. One evening, Hawley approached again, this time carrying his rifle. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Rachel nodded. Side by side, they fired at targets lined across the desert. Neither spoke much, but the silence was not awkward. It was mutual understanding. Two marksmen connected by the weight of what lay ahead. After an hour, Hawley lowered his weapon. "When I missed, I thought it was the end. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe I missed so you could take it." Rachel paused, looking at him. "This isn't about replacing you. It's about finishing the mission." He gave a small nod. "Then finish it." As the night stretched on, Rachel found herself alone again under the stars. The desert was quiet, but her mind was anything but. She thought of the insurgent, likely feeling untouchable behind his new walls of protection. She thought of the soldiers depending on her, of the civilians who might suffer if he lived. She thought of the shot itself, 2 miles farther than Hawley had tried, across wind, across heat, across time. A shot that demanded perfection in a world where perfection didn't exist. And yet she felt no fear, only resolve. This wasn't arrogance. It was faith in her preparation, in her craft, in the countless hours spent chasing precision when no one was watching. Somewhere out there, a target thought himself safe. Rachel Porter intended to prove him wrong. Preparation became Rachel Porter's obsession. From the moment she accepted the mission, every waking hour shifted toward one singular focus, the shot. Not just any shot, but the longest, most precise, most unforgiving attempt of her career. It wasn't enough to be good. She had to be perfect. Perfection, however, wasn't born in the moment of the trigger squeeze. It was built brick by brick, equation by equation, detail by painstaking detail. Her days began before dawn. She would rise in the cool darkness, when the desert still held onto the night's chill, and march to the range. Alone, she set up targets at extreme distances. While most shooters drilled within a mile, Rachel pushed beyond, testing herself at distances that seemed absurd to others. Her silhouette targets stood so far away, they blurred into the horizon. Through her scope, they appeared small as coins, flickering under the distortion of heat waves. She lay flat in the dust, adjusting her scope, running calculations in her head. Wind from the west, 2 knots stronger than yesterday. Temperature rising, air density shifting. She muttered numbers, under her breath like prayers. Each shot was preceded by minutes of calculation, adjustment, and focus. Each miss was recorded in a small black notebook she kept by her side. She did not curse her misses. She studied them, dissected them, learned from them. By mid-morning, other soldiers would wander by, curious. At first, some smirked, calling her obsession unnecessary. But when they saw the steel plates ringing at distances they had never dared attempt, the smirks faded into silence. Watching her was like watching someone attempt the impossible and succeed. At night, when the base grew quiet, Rachel worked. In solitude under the red glow of a lamp. Maps spread across her desk, pages of weather data stacked beside her. She memorized terrain contours of the mission site, tracing ridgelines with her finger, visualizing where she would lie prone, how her angle of fire would shift with the sun, where wind might funnel through valleys. She studied atmospheric science with the intensity of a graduate student. She read reports on wind shear, microclimates, and the way air density changes with humidity. She even reviewed studies on how mirage effects could warp perception at long range. If knowledge could be weaponized, Rachel intended to wield it. Her body needed conditioning as much as her mind. Hours of lying prone tested endurance. She trained by holding position for entire afternoons, ignoring cramps, hunger, or the gnaw of thirst. A sniper was not just a marksman, but a master of patience. To wait without moving was as critical as the shot itself. She practiced slowing her heartbeat, breathing in controlled rhythms, lowering her pulse until the rifle and her body moved. As one. Some nights, she walked the ridges around the base, feeling the wind on her skin, noting how it shifted with the terrain. She closed her eyes and listened, training herself to sense subtle changes others overlooked. To her, the air itself became a language. Hale noticed her relentless routine. Though he kept his distance at first, curiosity drew him back to the range one evening. He watched silently as Rachel fired, adjusted, fired again, until her notebook was filled with scribbled data. "You ever rest?" he asked finally. Rachel didn't look up. "Rest comes after the shot. You'll burn yourself out." "I'll burn myself in if I stop," she countered. Hale studied her, then nodded. He recognized the fire he'd carried it once himself. Still, even he seemed awed by the scale of her preparation. Word spread around the base. Officers noted her discipline. Soldiers spoke of her like a ghost, the sniper who trained when everyone else slept. Respect grew, quiet but steady. But Rachel wasn't chasing admiration. She wasn't even chasing records. She chased precision. Every mistake eliminated now meant one less unknown when the bullet mattered. She wanted the mission to be math, not chance. One night, exhausted but wired, she lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling. The enormity of the task pressed down on her, 2 miles farther back than Hale's attempt. The longest shot of her life. No backup plan. If she failed, others would pay the price. Doubt whispered, but Rachel silenced it with the same focus she used to still her breathing. Fear and doubt were noise. Noise distracted. Precision thrived in silence. To remind herself why she fought, she thought of the people who depended on this mission. Soldiers whose lives would be saved if the insurgent leader was stopped. Civilians who would no longer suffer under his operations. This wasn't about glory. It was about responsibility. As days turned into weeks, Rachel's preparation evolved into ritual. Each morning began with stretching, breath control, then hours on the range. Each evening ended with map studies and equations. She tested herself in varied conditions: windy mornings, blistering afternoons, moonlit nights. She learned how her rifle behaved in every scenario. She cleaned it obsessively, memorizing every curve and screw until it was an extension of her body. Eventually, even the doubters stopped questioning her. They watched from a distance, whispering that if anyone could take the shot, it was her. One evening, Hawley returned again, this time carrying his own rifle. "Let's train together," he said simply. Rachel nodded. They lay side by side in the dust, firing in silence. Hours passed, the desert echoing with cracks of rifles and the distant clang of steel targets. Between shots, Hawley offered small observations, lessons learned from his miss. Rachel listened carefully, never dismissing his experience. At one point, Hawley lowered his weapon and looked at her. "You're not just training for a shot. You're training to make history." Rachel shook her head. "History doesn't matter. Results do." Still, his words lingered. By the end of the third week, Rachel felt a shift. Her calculations aligned. Her shots rang true. The notebook once filled with errors now brimmed with consistencies. She began to sense, rather than calculate, how the bullet would travel. Precision was no longer forced. It became instinctual. She knew then. She was ready. Standing alone on the ridge, rifle slung across her shoulder, Rachel looked out over the vast desert. The horizon glowed with twilight, the kind of stillness It felt like a held breath. The mission loomed. The shot awaited. And Rachel Porter, the woman many had doubted, felt more prepared than she had ever been in her life. The day of the mission arrived quietly, almost cruelly ordinary. The sun rose with the same relentless intensity, baking the desert in waves of heat, but everything felt different. Every sound seemed sharper, every breath heavier. For Captain Rachel Porter, it wasn't just another day, it was the culmination of weeks of preparation, months of training, and years of discipline. She woke before dawn, heart steady but alert, her body already moving into ritual. Stretch, hydrate, check equipment. Each motion was deliberate, the practiced rhythm of someone who lived in precision. Her rifle lay on the table beside her, polished, cleaned, and checked a dozen times over. She ran her fingers along its cold steel, not as if she were touching a weapon, but as if she were greeting an old friend. The briefing was short. Intelligence confirmed the insurgent leader would be moving through a convoy that morning, stopping briefly at a compound deep in hostile territory. Security had doubled since Hale's attempt, making the target even more confident. But confidence, Rachel knew, was fragile when distance and patience were against you. A small team escorted her to the deployment zone. The journey was tense. A convoy of vehicles bouncing across uneven dirt roads, every jolt rattling nerves. Soldiers spoke in low voices, some sneaking glances at Rachel, as if trying to read her calm expression. To them, she was about to attempt the impossible. To her, she was simply solving the equation she had studied endlessly. When they reached the ridge, she stepped out into the blistering heat. The landscape stretched endlessly jagged mountains. In the distance, valleys carved by time, the compound barely visible as a smudge on the horizon. This was her vantage point. This was where she would make history or disappear into failure. Rachel dropped prone, rifle pressed into the earth, scope angled toward the compound. She adjusted her bipod, shifting her body until she became part of the ground itself. Every movement was careful, silent, rehearsed. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the wind, feeling its subtle push against her cheek. West to east, steady, 3 knots, exactly as her data had predicted. Through her scope, the world narrowed. The compound flickered in the distance, shimmering in the heat. Guards moved like ants, their rifles slung casually, unaware of the eyes studying them from miles away. Her focus sharpened until time itself seemed to slow. She didn't think about the danger, or the risk of discovery, or the dozens of lives depending on her. She thought only of the shot. Her spotter, a seasoned corporal assigned to assist, whispered beside her. Target expected in 3 minutes. Wind holding steady. Rachel didn't answer. She adjusted her scope again, dialing an elevation, adjusting for spindrift, calculating every fraction of distance. 2 miles farther back than Hale's attempt. A shot so long that even the curvature of the earth mattered. She factored it all, her mind running like a finely tuned machine. Minutes dragged like hours. Sweat traced down her forehead, but she didn't blink. Through the scope, the convoy appeared, dust rising in plumes as vehicles rolled toward the compound. Armored trucks, armed guards, movement everywhere. There, her spotter murmured. Middle vehicle. That's him. Rachel's breath slowed, her pulse quieted. She tracked the middle truck, waiting. The convoy halted, and the leader emerged, surrounded by bodyguards. A man in loose robes, confident, untouchable, or so he believed. Rachel's finger touched the trigger, but she didn't rush. Snipers didn't fire at opportunity. They fired at certainty. She waited, calculating. Wind steady, elevation perfect. She exhaled slowly, counting heartbeats. Her spotter whispered, "Ready when you are." The world fell silent. The noise of the convoy faded, The heat of the desert vanished. Even the pounding of her own heart disappeared. There was only the target, the rifle, and the invisible line between them. Rachel squeezed. The rifle cracked, recoil pressing into her shoulder. Through the scope, she followed the bullet's journey, not with her eyes, but with her mind, tracing the arc of math and instinct. Seconds stretched into eternity. The shot traveled across miles of air, across heat waves and wind currents, across time itself. Her breath held. The insurgent leader stood still, unaware. Guards shifted, scanning the compound lazily. The moment stretched longer, the bullet still in flight, as if the desert itself were holding its breath with her. This was the shot of her life, the culmination of everything, and it was still in motion. Time stretched, elastic, and unbearable. In those suspended seconds, Rachel Porter felt as though she was holding the world itself on a string. Her trigger finger had done its work, but her mind was still in motion, racing alongside the bullet as it cut through air, invisible to the naked eye. 2 miles, 2,000 yards beyond what most considered reasonable. Across valleys and ridges, over dust rising in lazy spirals, through a desert atmosphere that bent and twisted light. Her calculations had accounted for it all, yet even she knew once the bullet left the barrel, it was no longer hers. It belonged to physics, to chance, to the fragile balance between precision and chaos. She didn't blink, didn't breathe. Through the scope, she kept her eye fixed on the man in loose robes, the insurgent leader, the target of endless surveillance and failed operations. He stood near the compound, speaking to a guard, utterly unaware that death was whispering toward him across miles. Her spotter whispered beside her, "Impact in 3. His voice caught in the desert air. 2. Rachel's world compressed into silence. The noise of the convoy, the shifting guards, even her heartbeat dissolved. There was only stillness. Then it happened. The leader jolted backward, as if an invisible hand had ripped through him. His chest exploded in a red bloom that darkened the white of his robes. For a heartbeat, he remained upright, confusion frozen on his face. Then he crumpled into the dust. The compound erupted. Guards shouted, rifles raised wildly, scanning horizons they couldn't hope to see. Panic rippled through the convoy like fire across dry brush. Men pointed in every direction, some ducking behind vehicles, others rushing to cover the fallen leader. But it was useless. None of them could comprehend that the shot had come from beyond the horizon, farther than any of their weapons could reach. Rachel didn't smile, didn't exhale in relief. She kept her scope locked on the scene, watching every detail with surgical precision. Confirmation mattered. A sniper's job wasn't complete until the mission was verified. The leader lay still. Blood pooled into the dust beneath him, staining the earth a deep, ugly red. Guards pressed hands against his chest, shouting orders, but the movements grew frantic, then hopeless. Rachel tracked each gesture, each attempt, until it became clear. The target was neutralized. Only then did she allow herself a slow, controlled breath. Her spotter exhaled first, a shaky laugh breaking the tension. Direct hit. 2 miles. My God, you actually did it. Rachel's face remained composed. Her hands didn't tremble. Inside, a storm brewed, a mix of adrenaline, focus, and the crushing weight of what had just occurred, but she refused to let it show. Snipers didn't celebrate. They didn't cheer. Their victories were measured in silence. The spotter tapped her shoulder. You just rewrote history. Rachel kept her eye on the scope. Stay on target. Confirm no secondary threats. He nodded, falling back into discipline. Together they scanned the scene, recording every detail. Guards scrambled to form a defensive perimeter, unaware that the true battle was already lost. The convoy was in chaos, leaders shouting orders with no direction. Minutes passed before Rachel finally lifted her cheek from the stock of the rifle. Her muscles ached from holding still, but she ignored the discomfort. She packed her weapon with deliberate care, every motion precise. The rifle had served her faithfully, and she treated it with the respect it deserved. As she crawled backward from her firing position, blending into the rocks and scrub, the enormity of what she had accomplished pressed against her mind. A shot from 2 miles farther than another trained sniper had missed. A shot few in history had ever dared attempt. A shot that shifted the balance of a conflict. But Rachel didn't allow herself to think in grand terms. She thought only of the mission. Objective complete, threat neutralized, lives saved. The trek back to the extraction point was long and grueling. Heat pressed down in suffocating waves. Dust clung to her sweat-soaked uniform, but her mind replayed. The moment again and again, the trigger squeeze, the eternal silence, the impact. Her spotter broke the quiet. "You know they'll talk about this forever, right?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She adjusted her pack, scanning the horizon. "Let them talk," she said finally. "We move on." Yet deep inside, she felt the shift. She wasn't one for records or headlines, but she understood the magnitude. The shot wasn't just hers. It belonged to every calculation, every sleepless night, every doubt silenced by preparation. It belonged to Hall A, too, whose miss had paved the way for her attempt. Hours later, as the helicopter carried them back to base, Rachel sat in silence, helmet resting against the vibrating frame. Below, the desert rolled endlessly, vast and indifferent. When they landed, soldiers gathered instinctively, their faces etched with curiosity and awe. Whispers followed her through the dust. She did it. From that distance? Unbelievable, Rachel ignored them. She went straight to the armory, cleaning her rifle with ritual care. Only when the last screw was checked, the last barrel swabbed, did she allow herself to pause. She stared at her reflection in the polished steel of the rifle's scope. For the first time, she acknowledged what had happened. She had done what few believed possible. But she also knew this. A sniper's legacy wasn't measured in records. It was measured in the silence after the shot, the lives saved by its success, and the burden of carrying it forward. As she closed her notebook, filled with numbers, sketches, and equations, Rachel wrote one final line at the bottom of the page. 2 miles farther. 1 shot. Mission complete. Then she shut it and prepared for whatever came next. The return to base was nothing like the silence of the ridge. When Rachel Porter stepped off the helicopter, the desert dust swirled up around her boots, mixing with the chatter of soldiers who had already heard whispers of what she had done. Eyes followed her every step. Some stared in disbelief, others in admiration, and a few with the envy that always follows extraordinary achievement. But Rachel carried herself with the same deliberate calm she had shown before the mission. Her rifle, now safely cased, was slung across her shoulder, and her face betrayed nothing. Inside, though, a storm of exhaustion and adrenaline clashed, leaving her hollow. She wanted sleep, she wanted silence, yet she knew neither would come soon. "Captain Porter." A commanding voice cut through the crowd. Colonel Hayes, the base commander, strode toward her, his expression a mixture of stern professionalism and barely contained awe. "Report." Rachel saluted, crisp and steady. "Target neutralized, sir. Mission confirmed successful. No casualties on our side." Hayes studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll be damned," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "We've seen some extraordinary things here, Captain, but this," he shook his head, "debrief in 1 hour. Until then, get some water." Rachel saluted again, then turned away, eager for solitude. But solitude was elusive. As she made her way toward the armory, soldiers stopped her in the corridors. Some offered handshakes, others clapped her on the shoulder, and more than a few simply stared. She responded with polite nods, never lingering. The spotlight was never something she craved, and now it felt more suffocating than celebratory. When she finally reached the quiet sanctuary of the armory, she placed her rifle on the workbench. The room was empty, the smell of oil and steel familiar and grounding. Slowly, methodically, she dismantled her weapon, piece by piece, cleaning every surface as if nothing extraordinary had happened. It was a ritual, an anchor against the whirlwind building outside. The door opened behind her. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Holly. He walked in slowly, boots echoing against the concrete floor. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply watching as she ran a cloth down the barrel of her rifle. "Hell of a shot," he finally said, his voice low, controlled. Rachel set the barrel down, turning to face him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes carried weight, part pride, part bitterness, part something else she couldn't quite name. "You laid the groundwork," Rachel said quietly. "Your attempt gave me the data I needed. I didn't do it alone." Hale's jaw tightened. "Don't sugarcoat it, Porter. I missed." "You didn't. That's the story they'll tell." She studied him, choosing her words carefully. "That's not the story I'll tell." A silence stretched between them. Then Holly exhaled, a small, humorless laugh escaping. "You're a better shot than me. I can live with that. But just know once this gets out, you're not just a sniper anymore. You're a headline." Rachel frowned. "That's not what I want." "Doesn't matter what you want," Holly replied. "It's what the world wants. And right now, the world wants legends." He left without another word, leaving Rachel alone with her thoughts. The debriefing was clinical, a stark contrast to the magnitude of what had occurred. Intelligence officers documented every detail: wind, speed, range, time of day, angle of approach. Rachel recited her calculations with the same precision she had used in the field, stripping the story of emotion. To her, it was math and patience. To them, it was history. When the session ended, Colonel Hayes leaned back in his chair. "Do you realize what you've done, Captain?" Rachel hesitated. "I completed the mission, sir." Hayes shook his head. "No. You set a record that will be talked about for decades. The farthest confirmed kill in combat. 2 miles beyond Hale's attempt. You've changed the standard." She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "With respect, sir, my goal wasn't to set records. My goal was to take out the target." "And you did," Hayes said firmly. "But history doesn't care about intentions. It cares about results." Word spread faster than Rachel could have imagined. Within days, the story had reached beyond the base. Reports circulated through military channels first, then leaked to the media. Headlines blazed across news outlets. "American sniper hits target from record-breaking distance." Her name, once unknown outside her unit, became a symbol of precision and power. Rachel hated it. She avoided the mess hall, skipped gatherings, buried herself in maintenance and training. Fame didn't fit her skin. Every soldier who passed her now looked at her differently, not just as a comrade, but as something more, something untouchable. It was isolating. Halle kept his distance, though she caught him watching her sometimes, his expression unreadable. She respected him too much to pity him, but she knew the sting of being overshadowed. He was good, damn good, but history would remember him as the one who missed. Late one night, Rachel sat alone outside the barracks, the desert air cool for once. She stared at the horizon, the same horizon she had looked across when she took the shot. The silence pressed in, heavy and unyielding. She thought of the target, not as an insurgent leader, not as a mission, but as a man. Someone who had woken that morning, spoken to his guards, felt the sun on his skin, never knowing that his life would end because she had done her job flawlessly. It wasn't guilt, exactly. She had accepted long ago the moral weight of her role. But it was something deeper, a reminder that even precision carried humanity in its crosshairs. Rachel pulled out her notebook, flipping to the last page. Beneath the words she had written after the mission, she added another line. The shot was simple. Living with it is not. She closed the book gently, the desert wind tugging at its edges, and sat in silence, preparing herself for the storms of attention, pressure, and expectation still to come. For Rachel Porter, the mission was over, but her story was only beginning. The news spread like wildfire. What began as whispers in military briefings became a storm across headlines. Within a week, Rachel Porter's name appeared on television broadcasts, online articles, and newspaper front pages around the world. American Sniper sets unbelievable record. 2-mile kill shot rewrites military history. Meet Captain Rachel Porter, the woman who made the impossible possible. Her photo, one she had never authorized, appeared beside the stories. A grainy image from a training exercise. Her expression caught mid-focus, rifle in hand. She hadn't spoken a word publicly, yet the world was already writing her story. At the base, she became a symbol. Soldiers lined up outside her quarters, some seeking autographs, others hoping for advice, many simply wanting to be near the person who had achieved the impossible. She tried to keep her responses short, professional, detached. But the sheer weight of attention was exhausting. Colonel Hayes called her into his office one morning, his desk stacked with papers and his phone buzzing endlessly. Captain Porter, he said, pinching the bridge of his nose, you're about to become very famous, whether you want to or not. Rachel stiffened. Sir, with respect, I don't want to be famous. I just want to do my job. Hayes gave her a weary smile. I know that. But Washington doesn't care. They're already framing you as a national hero. Politicians want to shake your hand. The media wants interviews. You've become a tool one they'll use for morale, recruitment, and international image. Rachel clenched her jaw. I'm not a tool. No, Hayes said softly. You're a soldier. But right now, the line between those two is blurry. The first media crew arrived within days. They weren't allowed inside the base, but their vans lined the perimeter, cameras flashing at every passing convoy. Headlines speculated about her background, her training, even her family. Some reports painted her as a quiet genius. Others called her a lethal heroine. The most sensationalized ones compared her to mythical sharpshooters of past wars, exaggerating her story until it read like folklore. Rachel avoided the coverage, but she couldn't avoid the effects. Soldiers who once treated her as an equal now carried awe in their eyes. Some whispered her name with reverence. Others avoided her altogether, intimidated by her growing legend. Holly was one of the few who remained unchanged, though his silence weighed heavier each day. He spoke little, but Rachel often caught the flicker of conflict in his expression, admiration, tangled with resentment. He respected her skill, but he also knew her shot had cast a long shadow over his own reputation. One night, Holly approached her outside the barracks. The air was cool, stars scattering the desert sky. You know what they're calling you? He asked. Rachel shook her head. I don't care. They're calling you the ghost of the desert, the woman who can kill from beyond sight. He gave a bitter laugh. They're turning you into a myth, Porter. And you can't fight myths. Rachel stared at the horizon, silent for a long moment. Let them tell their stories. I'll keep living mine. Holly studied her, then nodded slowly. Just don't lose yourself in theirs. The pressure only grew. A week later, Rachel was summoned to Washington for a ceremony she hadn't asked for. She wore her uniform, medals polished, and stood before cameras as generals spoke of her bravery and precision. Politicians shook her hand, smiling for photographs. She endured it all with stoic professionalism, but inside she felt hollow. When asked to speak, she kept her words minimal. "I did my job," she said firmly. "I worked with my team. The mission was successful. That's all that matters." But her humility only fueled the myth. Reporters described her as the reluctant hero, the soldier too disciplined to bask in her own glory. Every headline made her feel smaller, more distant from the reality she lived. Her family, back home, was overwhelmed. Reporters camped outside. Their house, neighbors whispered with fascination, and strangers sent letters praising Rachel as a role model. Her mother called one evening, her voice a mixture of pride and worry. "They keep talking about you on the news," her mother said. Softly, "Everyone says you're a hero." Rachel closed her eyes, the weight of the word pressing down on her. "I don't feel like one." "Maybe heroes never do," her mother replied. Back on base, Rachel threw herself into training. She spent hours at the range, pushing herself to refine techniques that few others even attempted. She studied ballistics, charts until numbers blurred, drove her body to exhaustion with drills, and kept her mind focused on precision. But no matter how hard she worked, she couldn't outrun the legend. Soldiers whispered behind her, analysts requested her notes, and young recruits looked at her as though she held the answers to every impossible question. One evening, Colonel Hayes summoned her again. His tone was unusually serious. "Rachel," he said, dropping the formality, "you need to prepare yourself. You're no longer just a sniper. You're a symbol. And symbols carry weight. The higher they're raised, the heavier the fall if anything goes wrong." She met his gaze steadily. "Then I'll make sure nothing goes wrong." Hayes sighed, knowing she meant it, but also knowing no one could control the tides of history. That night, Rachel returned to her notebook. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "They've turned me into a story. But stories don't bleed, sweat, or doubt. I do." She closed the book, set her rifle across her lap, and stared into the desert night. The world might see her as a legend, but she knew the truth. She was just a soldier, one who carried the weight of a single shot farther than anyone before her. And that weight was hers alone to bear. Months had passed since the shot that changed everything. The world still whispered Rachel Porter's name, but on the base, life marched on. Missions came and went, soldiers rotated in and out, and the desert stretched endlessly beneath the Chong. Scorching sun. Rachel had learned to live with the attention. The stares, the whispers, the constant presence of her legend. It no longer pierced her like it once had. Instead, it sat on her shoulders like the weight of her rifle. Heavy, yes, but familiar. Yet something inside her remained unsettled. She had achieved the unthinkable, but she questioned what it meant. Was she still the soldier she set out to be, or had she become little more than a symbol others molded to their liking? Her answer began to form on a mission months later. A convoy of U.S. and Allied forces moved into a valley notorious for ambushes. Intelligence had warned of insurgents stockpiling weapons in the cliffs above. Rachel and her unit were deployed in overwatch positions, tasked with ensuring the convoy's safety. From her perch on a rocky ridge, Rachel scanned the valley through. Her scope. The range wasn't extraordinary this time, barely a mile, but her focus was as sharp as ever. The wind tugged at the edge of her hood, dust stinging her eyes, yet her breathing stayed steady. Movement. She caught it instantly. Figures shifting among the rocks, high above the convoy's path. Armed, concealed, waiting. Her radio crackled. "Ghost, this is command. You see what I see?" Rachel's call sign ghost still felt strange to her, but she answered calmly. Affirmative. Multiple targets setting up ambush positions. Requesting clearance to engage. Clearance came swift. Take them. Rachel exhaled slowly, squeezing the trigger. One target fell, then another. Her shots were precise, efficient, deadly. The convoy rolled safely through the valley, shielded by her unseen presence above. It was nothing like the record-breaking shot. No headlines would follow, no ceremonies, no politicians shaking her hand. But for Rachel, it was pure. This was what she trained for, not glory, not fame, but protecting lives with precision. When the convoy reached safety, the radio lit up with gratitude. Outstanding work, Ghost. Couldn't have done it without you. Rachel allowed herself the smallest smile. No one outside the valley would ever know what she had done. And that was enough. Back at base, Halle approached her with a rare softness. In his expression, that was clean work, he said. Classic Porter. Rachel looked at him, surprised. He wasn't bitter this time. There was no edge in his tone, only respect. You still think I'm a myth? She asked lightly. Halle shook his head. No, you're real. And that's more dangerous than any legend. For the first time, Rachel felt the tension between them ease. He no longer saw her as competition, but as a comrade, a soldier who had walked the same path, carried the same burdens. In the weeks that followed, Rachel began to find balance. She couldn't control the world's stories, but she could control her own. She started mentoring younger snipers, sharing not just her techniques, but her philosophy, patience, discipline, humanity. She taught them that a rifle was not a tool for glory, but for responsibility. Her notebook grew thicker with entries. Each mission, each lesson, each reflection found its place on the pages. She wrote not for the world, but for herself, knowing that words grounded her as firmly as any anchor in the shifting sands. One evening, Colonel Hayes called her into his office once more. This time, his tone carried something like pride. Rachel, there's talk of pulling you stateside. Training Command wants you. They want the woman who broke the record to shape the next generation. Rachel considered it. A life away from the battlefield, away from the desert, away from the endless tension of waiting for the next shot, but also away from the silence she had grown to rely on, the raw truth of combat where she felt most alive. Not yet, she said finally. There's still work for me here. Hayes nodded, as though he had expected that answer all along. Fair enough. Just remember, legends don't last forever. Soldiers do, if they're careful. That night, Rachel walked out into the desert alone. The air was cool, the stars bright above. She lay on her back, staring at the same sky she had watched on countless nights before. She thought about the shot that had made her famous. The impossible distance, the calculations, the stillness of her finger as it pressed the trigger. She thought about the target, the man whose life ended with that bullet, and the lives saved because of it. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it. Not pride, not shame, but acceptance. It was a part of her story, but not the whole story. She whispered into the night, as though speaking to herself, to the stars, to anyone who might be listening. I am not a legend. I am a soldier. And that is enough. In the years that followed, Rachel Porter's name remained etched in military history. Cadets studied her shot, analysts dissected her calculations, and storytellers continued to spin her into myth. But those who served beside her knew the truth, that she was more than a headline. She was discipline, precision, and quiet strength. And Rachel herself? She carried her story with humility, never letting it define her more than the next mission, the next decision, the next life to protect. Her shot had traveled farther than anyone thought possible. But her legacy traveled further still, not in the distance of a bullet, but in the lessons she left behind. Because in the end, Rachel Porter's greatest mark was not the record she set, but the reminder she gave the world that behind every legend is a human being, carrying the weight of every choice, every mission, every shot. And that truth, she knew, was the only one that mattered.